The AI Dennis. No, it's the real Dennis. Okay, good. It is 6 months out from Earth Day 2025 on April 22nd every year, and we are joined today by Denis Hayes, organizer of the very first Earth Day back in 1970. Earth Day 55 years later is now observed by over 1 billion people globally, as it's truly become a movement. Denis has had many roles over his illustrious career, including on the renewables front, having been the director of Solar Energy Institute, now called NREL under President Carter, and an adjunct professor of energy engineering at Stanford University. Denis is still our chair emeritus here at earthday.org and has been involved in our theme for Earth Day 2025, calling for a tripling of renewable energy by 2030. So welcome to 22 Minutes with Denis Hayes. Denis, it's an honor to speak with you today.
It's great to see you, Tom. Pleased to be here.
We've got a lot to get through, but before maybe we jump into renewables specifically, I thought maybe we could start sort of big picture around the power of collective action. What always amazes me is that singular day, that one event, that one march, like the first Earth Day, that there can be such a profound effect. So are you still a believer in that kind of direct action today in this often divided world? How big of an impact can collective calls for action and change really still make?
I think it's safe to say that the sort of things that we did then, when a major event, a Poor People's March on Washington, Vietnam moratorium, and Earth Day, could have a relatively straightforward impact on policymakers in D.C. There's just too much flux, too much noise out there right now. What a huge event with massive grassroots participation can do is focus attention upon an issue that otherwise could be lost in the noise. But you also have to have a ground game. Just like in politics, you can't just do it with advertising,
right,
candidates chasing around. You've got to have people going out and knocking on doors and actually delivering the vote.
I've been at this a little while. You've been at this longer than I have and seen a lot of things start, sometimes stop, sometimes restart, progress, then, a couple steps backwards. What's given you hope now as we look at it on the flip side? Like, for those people who are sort of overwhelmed, perhaps, with everything going on, so where do you see sort of, causes for hope? For the environment, for the climate, et cetera?
Well, there are a number of places where technology has made good strides, as well as at the same time, other technologies have had hugely negative impacts. But there's certainly hope from the fact that the things that we hypothesized and built economic models saying were true back in the 1970s and 80s, that, for example, there would be a learning curve with solar photovoltaics. We noticed early on, when the volumes were very small, that when they doubled the volume of production, the cost of production would fall by about 20%. Didn't know how far for sure that would go into the future. We were pretty confident we could get it from what was then $60 to $70 a watt down to $1 a watt. Whether we could get it down to 10 cents a watt, well, that would require some new materials, totally different kinds of manufacturing techniques. And turns out we can. That's very nice to have that go from theory to actually being proven. I also see hope as well as peril in social media. It is something that is very, very difficult for governments to control, as for example, the Chinese have learned with the penetrations of the Great Firewall of China. And it's a way for people to communicate. You have these other internet devices that allow end-to-end encryption, which allows you, even in a very oppressed society, to let people communicate with one another. And all of that is a source of hope to stand up against the advent of a Brave New World 1984 kind of autocratic future.
here at earthday.org, we've been pushing for climate education in the schools and um, really starting as early as kindergarten all the way through, sort of teaching it like any other subject and integrating it across curriculum. So it's not just a science subject, not just a math subject, but it can be integrated into an art program, into a language program, et cetera. What else do you think we need to do on the education level? Or are there any things you're seeing out there where you're particularly hopeful that maybe we're making some strides there? Because it does seem like it's one of those things where, yeah, if you don't know, if you haven't been taught, if it's in some cases actively taught uh, things that aren't true regarding climate, as we've seen some examples of here in the States and other places. Um, it leaves the public with a real fundamental lack of understanding what to do or what we should be advocating even for. So I'm just curious if you've seen any examples that you think feel like are working out there, or any other things we should be doing in terms of education around climate.
What you've been doing is I think been extraordinarily well done. And although I wouldn't say the threat is entirely gone, the war appears to be largely won. It's very difficult to find people beyond. About 20% of people always seem to be crazy, but beyond that wild ass fringe, it's hard to find somebody anymore after all that has happened that is a climate denialist. What has happened historically, of course, is that the oil industry, in a conscious emulation of the cigarette industry, just spent an enormous amount of money telling lies to people, and putting up programs in schools and publications distributed for free for schools that were just false. And we've managed to overcome much of that.
So are we going to see more jobs, better economic growth? Are we going to see, improved public health, those kinds of things, if we really go hard direction towards renewables?
So beyond any question. I mean, there is some misunderstanding about where those jobs will be. The way that you ride a learning curve down with a new technology, whether it's computer chips or solar modules, is by turning increasingly to robotics and mechanization, getting highly precise things performed by machines that operate 24/7, 365. If you look at a Chinese factory, and the American image of this is they're bringing in farmers from the countryside to sort of fasten cells onto modules and ship them out by hand. That's not happening. They've got mods that are bigger than a couple of football fields, and it's all done by robotics. And it's driven down the cost enormously. But then you have to do something with that. Those jobs are in selling them. They're in shipping them. They're getting them installed in fields and getting them installed on rooftops. And, there will be a fair amount of that going on. And I think similarly with regard to health, there are very few impacts with regard to a well-designed renewable energy strategy. I mean, people worry a little bit because they do involve some materials that, if mishandled, some of them can be harmful. A popular, not the most popular by a long shot, but a very popular solar module involves cadmium, which, if you ingest it, causes itai disease, which can be extremely painful and ultimately even lethal. But you never touch the cadmium. I mean, it's completely encapsulated. Right. Workplaces are designed to be ultra safe. And because it's a dangerous material, the companies that are making those modules are into not just recycling, but 100% recycling, so that none of that stuff ever gets into the ambient environment. And all of that's just infinitely better than even the cleanest coal plant that exists on Earth.
Yeah, that seems to be one of the talking points from the fossil fuel industry, I guess, is that, when you mentioned, in terms of batteries, there's lithium and lithium mining that's going on. With solar, there's, silver mining and things that go along with that. But it feels like, and from everything I've seen, maybe you can talk about this a bit, that those impacts pale in comparison to the kinds of impacts we see from coal, from fossil fuels, gas and oil production and distribution, and the burning of. um, is that just a talking point from the fossil fuel industry?
Well, it is a talking point, but I don't know that I'd say it's just a talking point. As with everything, there are ways to do it right and ways to do it wrong. And historically, a lot of this stuff has been done in what can only be called neocolonialism. We go to incredibly poor parts of the planet that are richly endowed with materials that we want to have. We set up a mine there and we ship the stuff off, and we do the refining elsewhere. We fashion the advanced material.
Yep.
And sometimes we sell it back to that country at an enormous markup to represent the labor that went into it. And sometimes that's just breathtakingly, appallingly bad. Think of cobalt mining in the Congo, done by 8-year-old kids instead of going to school, in just horrifying conditions. But we're recognizing that and demanding change, and sometimes not getting it, although there are claims. But the one country that I think is doing it is trying to do it well and could be a model in this regard is Indonesia. Indonesia is to nickel pretty much what Saudi Arabia used to be to oil. I mean, Indonesia is the enchilada. And we've been going in there and getting nickel ore and exporting it. And they're starting now to say no more. If you want to open up a mine here or even continue to operate in your mine, you've got to have your refinery in Indonesia. And by the way, we want to have battery plants here as well. And we want to be moving further up the value chain, which is great for Indonesia. It means that some things are going to be a little bit more expensive for the rest of us, but that's as it should be, because we should not be building a sustainable society on the backs of some of the world's most oppressed people.
Yeah. You mentioned batteries. I was going to ask you a little bit about that. With solar in particular, but all renewables, there's the issue around battery storage and, the ability to store that energy for when it's needed, which is a little different than how we use fossil fuels to generate energy. How close do you think we are to kind of putting to bed the concerns around having 24/7, renewable energy battery powered storage that can support that? And what do we need to get there that we don't have yet?
Well, a battery scientifically is just something that stores energy and makes it available. It's not necessarily something that stores electricity. And so we've got a whole lot of different kinds of batteries around the world that are there and pretty available. You said 24/7. That is not a huge problem. 24 is no problem. 24/7 is a small problem. 24/7, 365 is where you get to be problematic. That's the storage is going to be going for 6 months in parts of the world where the sun doesn't shine. that's tough.
Right.
And with that, it's probably going to be more a matter of building larger grids so you can bring electricity in from parts of the world where it's being generated at that time, relying upon things like deep geothermal, which are often quite available even in those sort of remote areas, maybe even especially in some of those remote areas like Iceland. You will be talking about other kinds of ways of doing things, and I suppose dramatically reducing the amount of energy that's needed.
Dennis, a lot of people kind of wonder, with renewables, it does take some, resources to build a solar panel, to build a turbine, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, do we have enough resources to do this and sustainably into the future?
Yeah, no, that's a terrific question. And one on which there's a lot of misinformation. There are ample resources. They are not distributed equitably around the world. As we move the basic resource from one country to another, it's important that we, of course, compensate the donor country or the supplier adequately. But over the long term, what becomes critically important is that we find ways to 100% recycle rare materials. And that requires a couple of things. One, a genuine public policy commitment, sort of saying, if we're going to be supporting this technology, it has to be designed for ease of recovery, ease of recycling. And we ought to be working with government policy carefully with the handful of companies that are now out pioneering this. Redwood Materials, for example, really innovative stuff. Company headed up by a guy that used to be with Tesla. And there are at least a dozen other companies that are doing this well. But with regard to the hard to get or costly to get or scarce materials that you have in solar panels or in wind turbines or in batteries or in any of these renewable energy technologies, they are all reusable forever if we design a system to make them reusable forever. And that should be one of the key fundamental points of public policy.
One of the reasons we are pushing for tripling by 2030 is that there's this, strong belief, one, that we have to be at that level so that we can meet the global goals to get to, net zero and or better by 2050. But also it's a bit of a scaling issue. We need to get there quickly. We need to have more so we can have more in terms of renewable energy. I mean, what do you think is kind of principally standing in the way of getting there? Or, a lot of people think we can certainly get even farther than that. And we should, the technology is available, et cetera. So what do you think is kind of getting in the way of that rapid deployment? Is it some kind of technology feature? Is it just political will? Is it corruption? Is it, a national problem, local problem, a global problem? Sort of where do you see the biggest sort of challenge to that rapid deployment that we're hoping to see?
Well, there's there are a few places where the rapid deployment has happened. In Southeast Asia, it's now really picking up steam in India. And where it has happened, it's mostly been as a result of industrial policy, of the government deciding that we want this to happen. So we will make sure that there's low interest money available to them. We will make sure that land is available to them. Sometimes it runs over property rights to get transmission lines built between places that can produce it and the places that use it. The country just says this is a national priority, just like the interstate highway system was in the United States.
Yeah.
And compare that to, for example, the United States. We have come up every now and then with terrific ideas. We've got one right at the moment that comes out of the combination of the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Act. Arguably, within market economies or mixed market economies, we've now got the strongest renewables policies in the world. We have an election coming up soon, and if that election tilts the wrong way, either in the White House or Congress, and God help us if both, then we would go almost certainly into a flip-flop, exactly the opposite direction.
What do you think gets people kind of motivated to take that step from, someone who's maybe aware of the issues and particularly around the environment, aware that there's some things going on they should be concerned about. Maybe they're not an environmentalist yet, but they're kind of ready to take that next step, or there's someone who's really been deeply involved for a long time. What do you think kind of motivates people to sort of, what's that trigger that gets people to really kind of engage at that next level, do you think?
For most people, I think it's remained the same. For me, strangely, it's one of the attractive things about environmentalism is that it has a number of issues that are very important to people in the movement that do not affect them personally. People care about saving polar bears who will never see the Arctic. People
right.
saving the whales, but have no personal relationship to them. But for the vast majority of people, what motivates them is something that comes close to home. It's getting a notice from your school that your children will no longer be able to go outside for recess because the air quality is too bad. getting a notice from your public utility that you can't drink the water that comes out of your faucet. You've got to go buy bottled water until they can replace the pipes. That sort of thing.
Right.
Just, it grabs people and causes them to take steps that otherwise they would not take.
Well, we're just about out of time, but I wanted to throw one last question at you. First Earth Day was in 1970. We can roll 100 years ahead from then to 2070. I don't know if either of us will be around then, but what would you like to see by that 100th anniversary? What's the sort of the best case scenario that we could be hoping for and seeing, a few decades from now?
Well, the math is pretty easy, Tom. I was 25 at the first Earth Day, so I would be 125. The odds are against me. But I'll say what I would love to see rather than forecast what I will see, which is
fair enough.
But we finally, as a species, find some way to come together as a species. I mean, the way that you build solidarity today, for the most part, politically, is by finding an enemy, and whether it's inside a country, the red states, the blue states, the red people, the blue people, or internationally. And it's just crazy that the biggest threat that we're facing globally right now is thermonuclear war, which is designed to basically wipe out the species in order to give one a chance to win because they launched their rockets first. I mean, it's literally insane, and yet we don't seem to be able to get past it. If we could somehow come together globally so that, things you were asking about 24/7, 365. There's a good chance as a result of climate change that Europe is going to be getting significantly colder by that time than it is today. It would be wonderful to be able to have and be paying a reasonable amount for it, electricity shipped across the Mediterranean from the Sahara Desert, where you have a whole lot of solar facilities that are generating huge surpluses. Right. Because we're coming together as a planet and trying to meet everybody's needs. And I say that, and I hear people there giggling. I mean, what kind of an idiot? But if you're asking what I would dream would be wonderful, it would be that somehow we get past this hating one another and find out some way that we recognize we've got to get together and solve these problems communally.
Well, I think a lot of people share that dream, Denis, and hopefully there's enough of us that can help make that happen. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you today. We really appreciate it. Thanks for spending 22 minutes with us, Denis, and we really appreciate you being on today.
The pleasure is mine, Tom. Thank you for the invitation.